Hello and welcome. I'm Sofia Tomacruz, and this is Rappler Talk. United States Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin III just wrapped up a visit to the Philippines on February 2. And this trip included a significant announcement that the Philippines would grant the U.S. expanded access to key sites under a military deal that allows the U.S. to access local military bases. Here to talk to us about this latest development is Gregory Poling, a senior fellow for Southeast Asia and a director of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. Greg, thank you so much for joining us to talk
Hi,
about.
thanks for having me. Magandang umaga.
Nice to have you with us. Greg, the first question I want to ask you first is just about the visit of Secretary Austin itself. How do you view the decision of a senior official to visit the Philippines again just a few months after Vice President Kamala Harris completed a trip to the Philippines last November?
I suppose it's one more sign of how serious both sides are about this process of alliance modernization. Every individual visit or trip has come away with these deliverables or a big speech. But what's really impressive is when you view them all kind of as a pattern, right? So at least going back to Secretary Austin's first visit in July of 2021, when he convinced President Duterte to rescind the threat to abrogate the VFA. From that point on, every one of these visits has shown a remarkable, I think, degree of seriousness from both Manila and Washington to bring the alliance into a new era.
Right. And this visit was no different in keeping with that pattern. So let's talk about the announcement on the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or EDCA. I want to touch a little bit on the history first. In the context of nearly a century of defense ties, or at least post World War II, how significant is this development to grant the U.S. Bigger access, bigger military access? How significant is that for the Philippines and the U.S.?
If we see it in the context of this broader program of deepening the alliance, which was laid out in the 2021 bilateral strategic dialogue. In November 21, we had the joint vision statement. All of those things combined, of which EDCA is a key part, show a desire to really bring the U.S.-Philippine alliance into the 21st century, bring it up to closer to the level of the U.S.-Japan, U.S.-ROC, U.S.-Australia alliances, because all of those alliances lost their strategic rationale at the end of the Cold War, but it was only the Philippine alliance that never really found a new reason to be, right? It always muddled through, first with the VFA and then the counterterror mission, and then the will we, won't we on maritime security throughout the Aquino and Duterte administrations. And over the last few years, we've seen, I think, both sides coalesce around this idea that the alliance does remain vital for both sides, but particularly for Philippine national security interests. But it has to change. It can't be the Cold War era alliance underpinned by the NBA, which of course no longer exists. It has to be something more equal. EDCA is something more equal. It's rotational access to Philippine facilities under the control of the Philippines for purposes that serve Philippine ends.
Right. And I think Secretary Austin and Secretary Galvez tried to stress that because there was a protest that took place right outside Camp Aguinaldo when the announcement was made. And Secretary Austin said it's a big deal. This announcement on EDCA is a big deal, but the U.S. isn't looking for that permanent basing presence. But I want to ask you now that this big announcement has arrived, what does it mean for the Philippines as a treaty ally for the U.S.? You did say that it could no longer exist in that Cold War era relationship. So how do you see this announcement perhaps changing uh, the Philippines' place in terms of both its role in the U.S.'s Indo-Pacific strategy and also just as a partner, as a treaty ally for the U.S.?
Right. So there's two ways to think about this. One is that EDCA is a necessary component to fulfill the obligations that the two sides have already made to each other. So, for instance, when the Supreme Court of the Philippines ruled EDCA constitutional in early 2016, it did so because it said that it's necessary for the Philippines' Article 2 obligations under the Mutual Defense Treaty. That's the article that says that both sides have to modernize their forces and provide access in order for the other side to fulfill their mutual defense obligations under Articles 4 and 5. In other words, if the Philippines wants the Americans to defend Filipino lives in the West Philippine Sea, it must provide some degree of access because Guam is too far away. And that's just the realities of geography. So implementation of EDCA now allows both sides to make good on the promises, particularly the promise that the American side made in 2019, when then Secretary Pompeo explicitly finally said that mutual defense obligations apply to any attack on Filipinos in West Philippine Sea. The second way to think about this is that, okay, all of that said, this is becoming a more equal alliance. A more equal alliance also has to be reciprocal. It cannot just be American obligations to the Philippines. Equal allies have obligations to each other, which means that in other regional contingencies, be it Taiwan or anything else, there will be expectations. Not necessarily that the Philippines is going to be at the vanguard of some kind of fight with China, but that there will be preposition of equipment, surveillance assistance, rear area support, right? All the things that would aid the U.S. in any real crisis.
Right. I'm just curious to touch more on what you just mentioned. I'm curious, what do you want to see, or what needs to be seen to kind of prove or have the Philippines also pull its weight in this alliance? Like, what do you want to see in the Philippines, and what does the U.S. want to see in the Philippines, and when it comes to being a reliable partner as well?
I think the most important thing right now is to build kind of the bones of the alliance. So we pay attention to EDCA because it's flashy and it's a singular thing that you can point to and say, here's one base. Mm-hmm. But I think the more important stuff is going to be the negotiation of the new defense guidelines, which is underway and part of that joint vision statement. The U.S. has negotiated 3 sets of mutual defense guidelines with the Japanese since the 1970s. This is the first time we're doing this with the Philippines. If we don't have an agreed upon vision for what the alliance is for and what our respective roles are in it, then it's always going to be brittle and susceptible to the political winds in both capitals. So that's key. Negotiating the new military information agreement, the GSOMIA, which as bilateral strategic dialogue last month, both sides committed to do by the end of the year. That's important. That will allow the Americans to share the kind of sensitive information with the Philippines that it does with its other allies. So the more you build those bones of the alliance, the more resilient and sustainable it becomes, and the more reliable it is. One thing that both the Duterte and Trump years made clear is that neither side could count on the other unless we institutionalize this more.
Yeah. That's an interesting point. But I think so it was the announcement was welcome, but also we didn't hear anything about new sites, although a lot of the messaging around the announcement was pointed towards China. I wonder how you see this changing, or the announcements of this big development changing the calculus in the region with respect to issues like the dispute in the South China Sea, and also, of course, Taiwan, because there are speculations also of where the sites might end up actually being.
Sure. So look, I think we can speculate about where the new sites will be. It was interesting that the only hints we got were when Secretary Alston said they'll be in strategic locations, and Secretary Galvez said that they will address maritime security, counterterror, and disaster relief, which is the 3 things in the original EDCA announcement. So I guess they're trying to say this is more of the same, right? This won't be a radical departure from what we've been doing previously. This is about following through on the commitments made 9 years ago. So if that's the case, I would expect of these 4 sites, 1 will probably be in Palawan. So, the Antonio Batista Air Base upgrade's been long delayed. It's finally underway. Oyster Bay, the Navy facility for Philippine Navy Westcom, seems like an obvious choice. We'll probably get another in the south, I would imagine. Given Galvez's statements about counterterror, one would expect that we see another facility, maybe an Army or a Marine base in the south. But the speculation is going to be on the Luzon facilities. The new PN base at the Old Hanjin shipyard in Subic is one option. I don't really know. A lot of people have thrown out the idea of one of the facilities in Cagayan province, which would obviously be focused on a Taiwan contingency, not a South China Sea contingency. My guess is if that happens, it'll be one of the 4, right? The message will be we're aware that Taiwan is a future crisis, and we are prepared to explore cooperation. But 8 of these 9 facilities are going to remain focused on the
Mhm.
established joint priorities of disaster relief, West Philippine Sea, and counterterror.
Right. But so now that EDCA is expected to be expanded and also its implementation is ongoing, also being sped up with the announcement of new funds, what sort of activity might we be able to expect with the larger U.S. military presence here in the Philippines? Or yeah, what might we be able to expect, and also what would you want to see under that sort of presence?
So everything about EDCA is meant to do 2 things at once, right? It's supposed
Mm.
to bring in U.S. funds, U.S. construction, and U.S. assistance to modernize the armed forces of the Philippines, which is a long-term prospect. And in the meantime, those U.S. forces can provide capabilities that are still being developed within the AFP. So it serves a short-term and a long-term goal. So everything you look at, whether it's in the air bases that are part of the original set of locations, or whatever new bases we get here, which again I expect would include Navy and Marine Corps bases in addition, it'll be about what can we build that makes sense for both parties, that the Philippines is clearly going to need in the long term, and that the U.S. can provide now. So radar, aerial patrol, command and control, a lot of those things that are necessary to improve capabilities to monitor the West Philippine Sea. If there are new Navy bases, I would expect facilities focused on sustaining Philippine patrols. Because one of the biggest problems for Westcom is they're on the wrong side of Palawan, and the trip from Puerto Princesa to the Calayan Islands takes way too long. They've got to go 600 miles round trip, and the Chinese don't. So
Yeah.
that kind of stuff makes sense. One of the more kind of future focused ideas is to do more joint training with U.S. Marines and Philippine Marines on asymmetric strike. So short range missiles. This would be if the Philippine Marines finally get the BrahMos missiles and set up the new Marine littoral combat regiments, as the Philippines is calling it, you could bring in one of the new U.S. Marine littoral regiments who have their own strike missiles to do joint training and build shared facilities.
Right. Um, yeah, so some of the things we'll be watching out for as well. One criticism against a larger U.S. military presence in the Philippines is that it puts a larger target, as some people would say, on the Philippines. What do you think of that?
Look, it would be naive to argue that there's not any truth to that. If the Philippines welcomes a greater U.S. footprint, and particularly if the Philippines engages in things with the Americans that could hypothetically be useful in a Taiwan contingency, even if that's just sensing and patrol, then it does increase the likelihood that China will view the Philippines as a party to any conflict over Taiwan. However, if the Americans are making an explicit Article 4 and Article 5 commitment to defend Filipino Marines at Ayungin Shoal, doesn't that increase the likelihood that Americans become targets of Chinese retaliation in the West Philippine Sea contingency? This is what a co-equal reciprocal alliance is. Alliances are about sharing risk and sharing capabilities. And if it's going to be an equal alliance, it can't only be the Americans taking on new risk.
Right. I just want to jump a little bit, Greg, but just to take stock of I mean, how far the alliance has come, right? And specifically on EDCA. This is something that a lot of regional observers have been waiting for many months of anticipation. And in a way, it was kind of years in the making to get to this point, at least under this military deal, and what that development's going to do for the rest of the defense partnership. How much of a factor was Duterte in, I guess, the long wait? And also, but also how much of this has to do with the Philippines, or how the U.S. sees the Philippines as a priority, or where it stands in its relationship with other allies.
Mm. The Duterte factor, I think, cut both ways. I mean, on the one hand, it clearly scared both the Philippine and the U.S. defense establishments. It made us finally recognize the fragility of the alliance as it was currently constituted. And so it probably did add some additional impetus to all this. At the same time, it effectively wasted 5 years. right? I mean, there was about 5 years where we could have been building EDCA facilities and we weren't, where we could have been doing joint patrols in the West Philippine Sea and we weren't. And so China is in much greater control of the West Philippine Sea today, precisely because Duterte set aside the arbitral award in 2016, pushed the Americans to arm's length, and wasted all those years between late 2016 and about late 2020, early 2021, when he finally began to allow the bureaucracy to reach back out to the Americans. And you are also right that the Americans deserve a fair amount of blame here. The United States has discounted the value and the reliability of the Philippine alliance, not only since 1991, but even before then. And now it's time for the U.S. to make up for lost time, recognizing that the Philippines is still a critical ally, the oldest ally in the region, in fact. And if the alliance is going to move into the 21st century, the way the Japanese and the Australian and the NATO alliance has, then we need to work double time.
Right. I asked that also because it's been nearly 9 years since the Philippines and U.S. signed EDCA, and in that time, it's also taken almost 9 years to fund and complete the first 5 sites. Yes, there are new sites that are coming, but if we look at just the original 5 sites, it's not complete. But now that the Philippines is sort of reviving this relationship under Marcos, how optimistic are you that the U.S. will also live up to its commitments in a timely manner, let's say?
I'm quite confident that U.S. and Indo-Pacific Command are going to want to get money out the door for the EDCA sites as fast as they can. I mean, they've been trying for the last 2 years, and just last fall, the number that was presented to us was that there was $60-some million earmarked for the EDCA sites. As of last night, Secretary Austin and Galvez say that it's now 82 million. So clearly the numbers are increasing, and they're increasing pretty rapidly. The biggest concern is going to be the politics, right? The projects at least 3 of the original 5 sites, I think at ABAB and Puerto Princesa, Mactan, and Lumbia, were all slowed down by disagreements with other agencies within the Philippine bureaucracy and with local government units. So making sure that those political issues are settled is going to be key, which I think one of the reasons that Secretary Galvez said we're not releasing the names of the sites until all the local stakeholders are on board.
Right. And in that case, I mean, but 2 things can be done at once, right? Like you can have the construction in the 5 original sites be taking place the same time as you get the 4 new sites going.
Yeah, you can. And certainly the fact that we have 4 new sites doesn't make the original 5 any less important. I mean, those 5 were picked for a reason, right? Basa Air Base is the most important for any Scarborough Shoal, any concern about Masan Lock. And ABAB is the most important for any contingency around Ayungin, Recto Bank, or the rest of the Calayan Islands. So we need to get money and construction and forces and equipment into those sites in particular, while also developing these new ones.
Right. Greg, some months back, or actually might have even been a year, you called, EDCA as sort of this missing piece and a big deliverable for the alliance. Now that it's here, what do you think should come next?
This is a problem with being a policy guy, right? Like nothing's ever good enough. It's why officials get so angry at both us think tankers and you journalists, because we never just say, okay, good enough, thank you. I think so. The next big thing I'll be watching will be the 2+2 in the spring. Well, actually, no, I take that back. Before I get there, the next thing I'm going to be watching is President Marcos's trip to Tokyo at the end of this month.
Right.
Almost as important as the progress in the U.S.-Philippine alliance has been the progress in the Philippine-Japan and Philippine-Australia relationships. Bringing the Philippines more into this alliance network, this mesh in the region, is beneficial for all parties. It helps take some of the burden off the Americans. It'll provide far greater training, capacity building support for the Philippines, and in a lot of cases in ways that are less politically sensitive, given the historical baggage of the U.S. relationship. So we've got what's called an acquisition and cross-servicing agreement being negotiated with the Japanese between Philippines and Japan, and a reciprocal access agreement, which is the equivalent of the visiting forces agreement. If those get wrapped up soon, that could open up a real floodgate of Philippine Japan cooperation and Philippine Japan Australia US cooperation. So look to Balikatan in April and see how much Japanese and Australian participation there is. Beyond that, I'll be looking to the 2+2 to see if we get the new defense guidelines,
Right.
and how if we get the names of these 4 new EDCA sites and where they are and what kind of missions they seem geared toward.
Yeah. Perhaps just as a last question, and because you did mention Japan, I'm curious what's your view on how likely it is that the Philippines and Japan might enter into some have a VFA, for instance, or perhaps a significant defense announcement when President Marcos travels to Tokyo next week on February 8th.
I don't know. It's coming. I mean, the
Yeah.
reciprocal access agreement has been talked about since the Aquino administration, at least 2014, I think. And they made clear last year that they're really getting close. The Japanese seem to have been prioritizing similar agreements they were negotiating with Australia and the United Kingdom first, but those are done. So the Philippines is up next. I don't know if it'll be ready when President Marcos gets there, but I do think it's coming sooner rather than later.
Right. And in that case, a stronger defense partnership with Japan would also, of course, benefit the Philippines and US alliance.
That's right. Last year, the Japanese sold the Philippine Armed Forces a fire control radar, the first time that Japan has ever sold military equipment overseas. Japan has provided, of course, concessionary loans and grants for other non lethal equipment like the Coast Guard platforms, long range patrol aircraft, the coastal radar. So Japan's already a major part of
Yeah.
the AFP's modernization program. Making that more formal and lowering the barriers to it will only be helpful.
Right. Lots of moving pieces. So Greg will definitely have you back with us sometime soon. I'm sure of it. But thank you so much for sharing your time with us again today. And really thank you for all your insights as well.
Thank you, Sophia. Pleasure.
This is Rappler Talk. I'm Sofia Tomacruz, and please join us again next time.